In fact, many such initiatives are there. The prevention of bribery of foreign public officials and officials of public international organization. This was a missing link where we did not have proper legislations. Now this is being introduced to take care of the bribery issues where foreign public officials are involved. Then Lokpal and Lokayukt bill is again an important aspect which will allow an umbrella of a framework which will help us in combating corruption. Now, as was said here, that international cooperation is something very important to fight corruption. I think United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC as we say it in short, has a very properly laid out systematic listing of the various aspects which would be required to fight corruption of all kinds. And in the various articles that have been mentioned in the convention, they deal with the subjects, and by being signatory to this convention, the countries commit themselves to fight corruption and adhere and comply to the various proposals, various aspects of the convention. India ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption on May 2011, and since last year we have been actively pursuing all forums which deal with this subject. We have been actively participating there. We are committed to implementing the various aspects of the convention to make our laws in tune with the international standards and ensure that our compliance is 100%. Now for this, the country, India, is being reviewed also this year, and two countries, our peer group countries, Uganda and Kazakhstan, would be reviewing India on chapter 3 and 4. And based on those review, a feedback will be given that what are the gaps which still remain in our legislative frameworks, in our implementation, in the various best practices that we follow, which need to be addressed, which need to be plugged. And I think it's going to be a very important aspect. With this review, I think we will learn and evolve into a better framework for combating corruption. Many policy initiatives are direct outcome of the convention compliance to achieve internationally acceptable standards and also to address gaps in the Indian framework of law and policies. India has recently supported the Siemens Integrity Initiative, and with the cooperation of our department, they have come up with a report, India Probability in Public Procurement, which basically the document comes up with various gaps in our public procurement systems and has given solutions how to address those gaps. The conflict of interest in public service is being closely examined for suitable policy measures to restrict conflicts that hamper public service as per UNCAC provisions. India has also supported academic initiatives in the field of preventive corruption. We are in agreement with the International Anti-Corruption Academy for collaborative efforts in the form of training, education, and research in areas relating to anti-corruption. Recently, an officer has been sponsored for a course conducted by IACA, and we are working together with some module which can be taught in this academy to train people in combating corruption. Recently, experts from India have reviewed Korea for UNCAC compliance, and as signatory to UNCSE India, we are actively involved in all initiatives, reviews, and meetings of UNCAC. India is also being reviewed this year under UNCAC, as I mentioned earlier. This will help in tuning our Indian legal and policy framework. So what we have benefited from the UNCAC arrangement, I would say, we have been able to map Indian legal provisions with UNCAC articles and see whether our compliance to each and every aspect of UNCSE agreement is being met or not. We are correlating it with data, the crime-related data, anti-corruption data, prosecution data, and the good practices, and we are correlating it with various provisions of the articles to see that our law is effective and it is being effectively implemented to combat corruption. We are identifying gaps and addressing them by the way of fresh legislations and amendments. As I mentioned in the previous slides about the various legal amendments or fresh legislations that have been introduced to achieve the international standards. of fighting corruption. We have been participating in review groups, as was being mentioned here. Recently, we had an asset recovery working group discussion in Vienna. Earlier also, we had many such discussions, meetings of the review groups as well as working groups. We have been actively participating. Not only we have been contributing in such forums, but we have also been learning from these experience sharing of various countries in such forums. So in the end, I would say that India stands to its commitment towards compliance of UNCAC, and we stand committed as a country as a whole to fight corruption to the last, so that this evil from the society, from our economy, can be rooted out, and we can come up with a very clean system and a developed country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dwivedi, for highlighting the steps which have been taken by India for combating corruption and also highlighting others which are still in the pipeline. I will now give the floor to Mr. Kenichi Kiyono for his presentation. You have the floor, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much, Madam President and Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, Your Excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here to talk about the criminal justice capacity building efforts by UNAFEI, focusing on UNAFEI ANCAC training program. And UNAFEI is a United Nations Far East Institute for prevention of crime and treatment of offenders. It was set up about 50 years ago by the agreement between the government of Japan and the United Nations. And we have been providing training courses for criminal justice officials from developing countries. And so our training institute is not an institute for academics or for students, but our institute is a training institute for police officers and prosecutors and judges and prison officers and probation officers. So we have practitioners for professors from those areas. And so today I'd like to talk about the importance of capacity building of criminal justice officials. I'd like to explain this in 3 ways. To do this, I'd like to ask you several questions. Firstly, I very much admire and praise the effort of the UNODC and ALCO in drafting and ratifying the UN Convention Against Corruption. But to eradicate the corruption from your countries, is it enough to ratify the convention and make legislation? Of course not. After making legislations or ratifying the convention, you must enforce it. The number of the countries which have ratified the UN Convention is as many as 167. But as you see, many countries which have already ratified the convention have seen little progress after the ratification of the convention. Why? Why they have seen little progresses? Because the people have not changed, and the culture of corruption have not changed, and also the systems have not changed. I mean systems, administration systems, procurement systems, was systems of the transaction in civil parties, and so on. You must change these systems, people's cultures to eradicate corruption from your country. So how you can eradicate, you can change these difficult to change matters, people, culture, systems. The most important measures to tackle corruption is three-pronged. That is preventive measures, punishment, and publicity. You can rephrase preventive measures as a deterrence. You can rephrase punishment as enforcement. You can rephrase publicity as awareness raising or education. And which do you think is the most important? And there are very limited resources to allocate. You may argue, but I will claim that punishment is most important. And and there are limited resources to allocate the resources to punishment have been adopted by Japan and Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong ICAC has allocated 70% of their resources on punishment. And what is important to punish the corrupt officials? The most important thing is to punish the highest ranking of officials, most influential officials, if they are corrupted. And also, on the other hand, to punish the lowest ranking of officials if they are corrupted. Both two are most important, and both two are indispensable. No corruption is too small to punish, and no corruption is too big to punish. So so the punishment is most important because they have a big power in the preventing corruptions and publicity against corruptions. In Japan, there is a maxim which means one punishment deters 100 crimes. So punishment has very powerful deterrent powers. But for the third point, what is most difficult in punishment offenders, punishment corrupted offenders, is that it is very difficult because corruption is a hidden crime, secretly committed amongst collusive parties. So it is very difficult to detect for criminal justice officials and law enforcers. So law enforcers must have skills to detect the corruption. And also they must prove the bribery cases beyond reasonable doubt. So you must collect the evidences. And not only the content is important, but also the procedure is important. Because corruption is committed secretly, the investigator must have very high skill of financial investigators. And also they must know the systems and the procedures and practices of the business. And also they are familiar with accountancy, and they are familiar with bank records, and they must analyze the flow of funds, and they must analyze who is